Hello, welcome to History Chats this afternoon. Ooh, that's kind of loud actually. Let me turn down the gain a bit here. Yeah, hey, welcome to History Chats. Yeah, we're gonna get started in just a bit here. Continuing our theme this week here with our month-long theme of some more people you should know. This time talking about somebody who's a little unusual in that this isn't somebody who has left a legacy in terms of like, oh, I've seen that name on a street sign or, the historic home or, a business or something like that. But as we'll see, I think Mr. Schubert here, sorry, Professor Schubert is going to make up for that. Yeah, should be very interesting. While we're waiting, let me just tell you about some stuff that's coming up. This weekend, we actually have our next History Speaks event. We're going to be seeing a screening of a documentary called Tuba Ted, The Man and the Music. So this is a local documentary on a local guy named Ted Gaydon. And if you know Ted, he's a great storyteller. He's got a lot of really cool, very very interesting stories. Very funny guy, and also very heartfelt guy. So. He's actually going to be here, as well as Susan Rates, the director, the documentarian who did this. So this is going to be at 2 o'clock this Saturday on June 11th. It's only going to be in person. We are not live streaming this for other reasons here, but it should be a good program. So if you're looking for something to do on Saturday this week, this would be a good program. Hoping to see people come out for it. Yeah. So that's something that's exciting coming up. I guess I can say for History Chats, we can continue to, look forward here. We're only 2/5 of the way through, but we're going to have some more stuff coming up. And next week, particularly, kind of an interesting change, is Vilas Macmillan. I think I said that right. You may not have, if you're from the Western area and you've been around, you may know of him. Certainly there has been some place names that still exist that were named after him. Macmillan Park, I believe it's called, for example. But if you're not familiar, there's a very interesting story about the town of Weston becoming a village, and Mr. Macmillan here was an important figure in that. So it's going to be an interesting story about. Again, an area that we don't necessarily talk about as much, but I think it'll be a good program. So that's what's coming up. But today, I'm just going to double check everything, make sure it's working. Yeah, good. Yeah, why don't we get started here? Hi. Oh, a little crooked there. Today we're talking about Frank Schubert. Oh. Bit of a delay here. Hold on just a second. Should have checked this. I think if I... Okay, hold on. Sorry. It's going to bother me if I see the delay the entire time, so I'm just going to... Let's try this again. Oh, I hope I don't need to... restart the program. That would be unfortunate. Should have thought about this before. There we go. Sorry. All right. Thanks for bearing with me for that second. Yeah, we're talking about Frank Schubert. So again, probably not something that you heard of necessarily, unless you're an aficionado of the 1800s music scene here. But certainly somebody that has left an interesting legacy, and partially what I claimed here is the hardest working musician in Marathon County is a bit of a hyperbole, but not too much for his generation. He's pretty much up there. There's not too many other people that are as busy or active in the music world as he is, and beyond the music world. So let's get into it. So to start, he is a immigrant. He's a German-speaking gentleman. He comes here. Well, he's born in Austria. Sort of. He says Austria when he responds to official documentation and stuff. Until 19 1820, thereabouts. And I believe the reason being, after that point, he starts to say, if we go in here, so there's Austria. But before the end of World War I, the Austrian Empire, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire later, controlled a lot of this region. And later in 1920, he starts to say, or at least the last census I can find for him, but also his children say that he is born in Bohemia, which is today modern-day Czechia, or the Czech Republic. So I'm guessing that he actually was northern Austria into Czechia. That's probably where he came from. But even if it isn't Austria, and it is Bohemia or Czechia, he is German-speaking, and he does, when he immigrates to the United States at around the age of 19, he's very much part of this German cohort of people who are coming and working here. Now, this is going to be a theme for him. I know a lot about some aspects of his life, but even basic things like where did he come from and where did he live for the first, I know from the censuses he came here in 1867. I don't really have any records of where he ends up until the 1880s, so or late 70s. So we know that at some point he marries his wife, Antonia, and then he moves to Wassa at some point by the end of the 1870s. And the 1880s is really what we're interested in here. So yeah, what happens in the 1880s? Well, he starts a beer garden. He's got a concert or cornet band, a juvenile band, and a men's choir. All kind of going up at the same time. So we'll start with the beer garden. So this is a map of Wassa from 1884. It's one of the earliest maps that gives this much detail, so it's kind of nice in that. But if you look at the very bottom here, you can see this little blue rectangle on the right side. That is along Grand Avenue. And if we zoom in, you can see the breweries that had come to Marathon County, specifically to the Wassa area. So Matthey and Reuter in the 1860s get started making beer for the thirsty population of the area. There's also this bit to the south, which I've seen some sources that seem to indicate that there was a brewery park in the late 60s, and I'm inclined to believe that there is something there or another. I don't know if it's a full-on beer garden, or what you see here, which is when Schubert takes over by end of the 1870s, 79 or 80, he creates Schubert's Park. So there might have been something earlier in more of the traditional German beer garden style, which is, a beer garden is on its surface, a place to go drink beer outside. So usually near a saloon or a tavern, or in this case, a brewery. You could go out and, they'd have nice trees and foliage and arbors to kind of keep you out of the sun. And you could go and enjoy a picnic out, so to speak, with some beer with friends or what have you. The American version of it, the beer garden, is very interesting. The German-American sort of iteration on this often includes more than just arbors and tables to people to, have a stein of beer. As you can see here, Schubert, after he starts the park, he builds a building. So there's a saloon in the front, right? That's the SAL. It kind of looks like SAT, but it's saloon. And then there's a concert hall. So there's a place to go hear some music, go dancing, or have events, gatherings there. And then interestingly, there's a little bowling alley on the side, which again is kind of typical for this era for the German-American community. Americans want a little bit more than just a place to go, drink beer. But you could also do that as well. Now, we'll talk more about what ends up happening to this, but from 1880 or so, he is in charge of a pretty popular place. In 1883, for example, there's a big celebration of like the anniversary of the very first, I think it's like 200 years or 250 or something like that, something, ways earlier, the very first German-American settlement in North America, in Germantown, Pennsylvania. And it's a huge event. The whole county shows up. They have a big parade that ends at Schubert's Park. So he's not just, one of many taverns and saloons. It's a central place in the community. And he decides, hey, it would be good to have some music. If we have this traditional experience of, going out and having beer, maybe with some bowling or whatever else, but we need some music to keep people excited and interested and make it worth their time. And he pulls together what was left of the old cornet band. So let's talk about the cornet band. This is the first iteration of it in front of Music Hall in 1871 or so. This is a band And I'm going to go off a little tangent here about the music because I think it's very interesting, and hopefully you'll learn a little bit about music history. I don't know if most people have thought about brass bands. They're just sort of instruments, sort of an older version, maybe kind of vaguely military-esque, right? And that's very much what's happening here. These instruments that you see are actually not something you see in most groups. These are very antiquated. We get rid of them. Actually, by the time that they start this band in 1867, these are already kind of on the way out. Because these are what are called sax horns. It's primarily what they are. These long-belled instruments that are meant to be played. Well, here's a more contemporary version. This is the 1st Brigade Band, the Wisconsin group that continues to, since the 60s, 1960s, has been taking these old instruments and refurbishing them and then performing them in sort of a modern sensibility. Not modern, I should say, playing like Civil War era group, right? So you can see these guys have these long bells. It's a fixed mouthpiece, so you can't like move it. It's just going to go over your shoulder. And the music, the brass music that they're playing, brass instruments have this bright tone that can cut through the open air pretty easily. And you can see that kind of works pretty well for a military band. And the way that they would play these is with the bell over your shoulder. You'd put these guys in front of a column of troops marching, during the Civil War, for example. And the music, as they would go from, they did a lot of marching back then. So as you go from place to place, the music would go back to the people behind them, and they would, get the opportunity to entertain, to at least keep their mind off of their, their trek for the day. But obviously, it's not ideal in some circumstances. In particular, it's not ideal because the audience is behind them. It's not great if you want to play a concert in front of people. So we start to see that shift, and they adopt more of a European, sort of contemporary American style brass band on the military scene, and in sort of the trendier places and cities across the country. We'll see that transition a little bit later. But in 1867, Wausau decided it should have a band. We're out of the Civil War, there's this new excitement. We want to see the future of the community. And so they end up buying a bunch of instruments. At this point in time, it's a community effort. They kick in money, and the money then goes to buy instruments and uniforms, which, it's not something that you can just go, down the street and, ask the local high school band program, hey, can we borrow a sousaphone for the summer? We want to play a few concerts. Like, that doesn't work because there is no instruments. Nobody's bringing up, sax horns or cornets or anything like that. So they had to buy it. You can tell that they got the maybe instruments a little cheaper, I would imagine, more affordable because they were a little more antiquated. But anyway, they didn't just invest in instruments and uniforms. You also had to have musicians, right? These are all adults. Many of them have never played music. They didn't, go to school to learn in, high school band. No, you don't have that. Many of them didn't know how to read music or make sounds on an instrument. And so they actually hire somebody. It's Edward Kretlau, who is a cigar maker and actually is one of the guys who apparently in 1867, 68 is also in charge of that brewery park that I talked about that might exist to some extent. Well, he's got some musical experience, and so he decides to help them out. And so they call them the professor, the guy who runs a band. The reason is that they aren't just the guy waving the baton in front of the group or picking the instruments or who's going to play what or anything. He's physically teaching them, here's how you make a sound with your instrument, and here's how you do all of that. So Kretlau does this for about 2 years. After which point he decides to go to Milwaukee to see how well he can do as a musician down there. Vetter takes over because Kretlau makes sure that there's somebody there to continue the process, right? He doesn't just say, all right, good luck, and he leaves. He makes sure that there's somebody in place to replace him so the band can continue. So Jacob Vetter comes up. He spends about 2 years in charge of the band, and then he decides to have enough and goes back to Milwaukee. It's going to be a common theme here. He, too, makes sure that there's somebody else to take over the band. That becomes Richard, this guy here. I don't know if you can see added a little bit of color here. Richard Ballman. At this point, I should probably talk about what's going on here. So I'm going to try not to get too distracted in the larger history of music here. But there's an interesting thing that happens. For years and years and years, centuries, Composed music was something that the church did. And then more recently, it was something that the elites of Europe were doing. You got people like Mozart, right? This famous composer. Well, he's not just composing for himself. He's composing because a patron, a royal, monarch or what have you, he says, hey, I want to pay you to write music specifically for my court. This kind of continues into the 1800s, and you see most of the composed music. There's also sort of the stuff that the folk dances, the stuff that's everybody the peasantry does, but that's kind of different from instrumental music, especially like this. But this is kind of bridging this in an interesting way, because what ends up happening is these bands come out of the military style, right? These are bands that were created and supported by the government, so that they could have a military band to keep the troops entertained during war. And this is the same thing that's happening in Europe. A lot of these groups, the modern concert band is developed as a military band. It's from the military. But in the mid-1800s, you start to see groups that are finding success commercially. This is an interesting one in the sense that this is a group that is supported by the community. But there's also not enough community interest to support them financially. And if you're going to be a professional musician and that's what you did for a living, like Bauman can kind of stick around in Wausau, and he will, because he also has a day job running a shop. But most of these guys, if you wanted to actually make it and dedicate your time to playing music, you can't just do that and also be in Wausau. But in a place like Milwaukee, there are commercial bands. There are bands that make a living and support musicians full-time playing music, which is kind of that interesting thing. Like, it kind of gets pulled down and becomes the popular music. If you had a good enough band and people wanted to, keep you employed, for different events, then you can make money, and you don't need to worry about like the government or some king or the church telling you, yes, compose some music. Anyway, that's kind of a longer story here than we need to get into. But the point is that in Wausau, we don't have the population to really support that sort of thing yet. Maybe in someday we will. And in the 1880s, maybe we do, to an extent. Now, Bauman runs the band for about 2 years, but then eventually things kind of fall apart. There's another guy who comes to town named Karl Reisenweber. Apparently, there's a disagreement with the band leader or some of the musicians, that he decides to go off and start his own band, which takes all the good musicians with him. And so the cornet band kind of folds, except Karl Reisenweber is said to be the Wausau Cornet Band, which is fine, except in around 1876 or so, he decides to go back to Milwaukee to do the same sort of thing, right? But he does not make sure that there's somebody to replace him. In fact, when he leaves, he takes the band with him. And so there's a period where, Bauman and Mr. Mueller sometimes put together a little group, what was left of the cornet band. But really, there's no instrumental music here in the late 1870s. Until Frank Schubert. I don't know if we should give him complete credit, because there were other people at the same time doing the same thing, but he certainly is the guy who steps up, and he creates a band. He takes that cornet band and he takes the core of it, adds some new people. He becomes, he's a professor just like the other guys are. He teaches how to play, and he puts together his own group. And this is that first iteration of this group. There he is. Brief aside here. At one point, I had most of these pictures colorized, the whole thing. It was very exciting, put a lot of work into it. And then I had a hard drive fail with all of those on them. So for the sake of this program, I went through and did some colorizing, but it's a lot of work. So I just did a couple people to kind of draw attention as opposed to the full thing. Anyway, there's Schubert. This is his band. And this goes really well. He's pretty good at it. There's an appetite. In the 1870s, you see a large, resumption of Germans settling here. And so the combination of having a beer garden, a place to go hear music, and a band, it works out pretty well. And it continues. So you can see here, just actually go back for a second, just to point this out, that Germanization, or the sort of modernization of the brass band. The cornet band kind of shifts away from those long sax horns, which you can still see here. He's still got a sax horn. But now you see these, cornets more prominently. You see the clarinets, reed instruments, flutes, these start to get added. You can see this is a later version of it. The sax horns are mostly gone, and instead you have trombones. So there's a development that's happening in the 1880s that's fascinating. I don't really want to get into the musicological discussion about this, about what this sounds like, although it is kind of fascinating. If nothing else, because I don't really have music for a lot, recorded music for a lot of this, but anyway. The problem is that Schubert is having a good success with his band, but he's not the only one. And for a couple reasons, he ends up pivoting to something else, in part because of the prominence of another band leader named Frank Dana. This is his band. He starts a band around 1880, and he's going to be very successful. Interestingly, he's going to have some different names. He's going to be known as the Forest City Cornet Band, the Silver Cornet Band, as you see here. Sometimes he goes by the Silver Piston Cornet Band. Ooh, new piston cornets. That's exciting. Yeah. We'll talk more about Dana a little bit later, but because of Dana's success, and he is very successful, Schubert finds maybe a different avenue. He kind of pivots. He still has the brass band, but he also, in around 1882, starts a juvenile band. And there's a couple reasons for this. So again, here he is. Here's a better picture of him and the band. So there's a couple reasons that this is important. One, I'm going to take the cynical business route here and say that one of the advantages here is you get to have, performances. You get to march in parades and do public concerts. You don't have to pay your musicians. I think it's possible that they even paid him to be part of it, right? Because you got to buy uniforms and instruments and all of that sort of thing. But besides that, right? Besides the financial betterment of this, this is good because you can train up a good generation. Like one of the problems in the late 1870s is we did not have a program, an ability to develop musicians into the 1880s. And so if we have juvenile bands like this, which are becoming popular, this is a great opportunity to train a next generation of musicians. Hopefully in the 1890s, we won't have what we had in the late 1870s. It also provides a good opportunity. These kids get to march in a parade and learn to play music, and that's exciting. And their parents are happy because they get to get them out of the house and don't have to worry about whether they're getting into trouble. It's also kind of like a military-esque sort of thing without having to send them off to military camp or whatever. But yeah, so this goes pretty well. But there's also a fourth thing that I mentioned here, the men's choir. And for this, I'm going to take a page out of Louis Marchetti. He talks about this under the title Societies for the Cultivation of Song, which is a very fun way to say that. So he says that actually this is something that's been happening for a while. Men's choirs have existed in Wausau and the surrounding area since the 1860s, starting with and here's where I'm going to run into my German pronunciation issues, Männersgesang, something like that. Louis Scorch was put in charge of this group. He was a wagon maker, and he did a good job, but stuff changes. It eventually goes under. But it was exciting, and so people got together and said, "Hey, we ought to get that back up and running." And so that leads to the Eintracht being formed in 1874, Harmony, under Henry Newman. And apparently, this is a very successful group musically, not so much financially. In fact, they ended up hitching their fate to a German club, sort of a larger group that was promoting Germanness. And apparently the German club in 1877, I guess I got cut off there, in 1877, they had a whole event where they brought in like bands from Milwaukee. They were going to have this whole song and dance. Let's try that again. It kind of bankrupted the organization. Short story, long story short. So there's a few years without singing again. And then you see in 1884, Professor Moser creates a group called Littita, I think. I don't know where that comes from. It's not German necessarily. I think there's a couple things like there's a Roman goddess of gaiety and, fun. So I'm guessing maybe that's what that's in reference to. Not sure. And then you have the Wasserliederkranz, which is started by Schubert. Now, Moser is going to leave town, and so the Littita is going to, go defunct. There's also another group that Louis Marchetti writes about during this period. The let's see, bring him up. Eichenkrantz. Another group They end up going for about 10 years, but then, a lot of times the guy in charge, the main impetus behind all of this, leaves town, and then the group just kind of falls apart, which is what happened in these two. But it's helpful, at least, that those musicians had a place to go because the Liederkranz was up and running, right? So, Liederkranz. Men's choir, singing in German. It's very much sort of this German tradition. It's very popular all across Wisconsin and the Midwest. This is the Meta Singing Festival, or Sangerfest, in Sheboygan in 1913. They had a couple here as well. Things are going very well. But again, financially, it's still kind of tough for Schubert. He's got a lot of plates spinning, and they're still not quite, it's exhausting to make it support a family, right, doing this. And so after about 4 years in 1888, he approaches the Liederkranz and he says, this is great. I love Wausau. I love the community, what we're doing here. I need more money. Is it possible you could possibly pay me more? I have a, opportunity to go elsewhere, but I would love to stay here if you can make it work. But of course, these guys are all working class men. They don't have the expenditure to just say, yeah, we'll pay you a living, a wage. They don't have that money. It's not a big group. And so in 1888, Schubert leaves town. After the 4th of July celebration, he and his family go to California. So what is he doing? Well, again, if we look at Louis Marchetti and his account of all of this, he claims this. He says that through Schubert's orchestra, musical taste was greatly developed, and his departure was greatly regretted by all lovers of music. He went to California, where he was given the place of teacher of music in some Catholic sisters' boarding school in St. Joseph. Maybe. I don't want to say definitively one way or the other. I will say that newspaper accounts of the time don't seem to correlate this, monastery sort of religious life. In fact, here he is with a city band in San Jose in 1889, and around the same time he is running a tavern. Notably in 1905 he makes kind of regional, and it was reported in Wausau, but he gets held up by this daring highway robbery along with some of his patrons. So yeah, not so, whatever he ends up doing, he's not here. He doesn't end up coming back to Wausau at the end of his life. Although I actually don't know very much about what happens after this. After you stop seeing him actively involved as a tavern keeper and stuff, he just kind of disappears. I can't find a death record or an obituary for him. I was able to interestingly find this, which is the naturalization papers. So in 1892, he became a citizen of these United States. Interesting, because he could have been a citizen for the last, 30 years, but he decided not to until he moved to California, which I think also speaks about the German community here, that you didn't feel that pressure to become an American. Or maybe he just wasn't, active in, wanting to vote or do the things that you need, to be here. I'm not sure what the deal is. Also, the immigration status, I think there might have been more of a push in California to remove the immigrants, whereas here you could kind of just fit in. Anyway, what I do know, though, is this legacy. So we talked about Schubert's Park. So Schubert's Park is going to continue after he leaves. We'll talk about the guy Anton Jakubka takes over. We'll talk about him in a second. But after Jakubka, it goes and becomes Grand Avenue Park for a bit. And then in 1892, it burns down. There's a big fire that destroys the Ruder Brewing Company here on the right. That's what this is, as well as the park. And so the Ruder Brewing Company rebuilds, and they decide to build this building here. And this is Columbia Hall, or Columbia Park. There's still a park around it. There's an interesting adventure. They thought that maybe this would be a good investment, but it turns out that it wasn't super helpful. Despite running it for about a decade, by 1905, 1906, they've decided to transform it into a bottling facility. Although I will say that during that decade, a number of important musicians got their start here, were attracted to come to Wausau because of the opportunities here. So anyway, there you go. But as I said, Anton Jakubka, who's here, he's a Hungarian guy, immigrates here, and becomes a very important member of the Schubert organization, kind of the right-hand man. And he takes over the beer garden and the band, actually, I think. This is Jakubka's band. Maybe? by the later years. I think this is probably still the city band, although the names of this is hard to track. But I do know that this is Jakubka here on the right. This is also George Geyer or Gear. He's also an important guy. He has a band occasionally here and there. I don't know who's in charge or what the deal is, but clearly, this Schubert isn't in here, and this would have been before he left. So, yeah. Now, Jakubka, unfortunately, tragically passes away of a very sudden and difficult illness that hits him in late 1888 into 1889, somewhere in there. And so, everything kind of passes on to the other hand. But even by that point, from the music scene, I should say also just like the juvenile band also kind of goes away without Schubert there. There were a number of other juvenile bands or boys bands in the early 20th century, into the early 20th century. They kind of fall away after the schools start to adopt music in the 1920s, but also kind of a presence, usually supported by a church like St. Paul or St. Stephanus had a band as well. There's a larger story there, but we'll kind of keep going on. Anyway, by the time that Schubert leaves, though, Jakubka and the other musicians that would have played with him had already, largely the good ones, had found a home with Dana. Remember, Silver Cornet Band. Well, here he is in 1887, he gets the approval to become the new band of the 3rd Regiment of the Wisconsin National Guard, which is a big deal. It's a big deal. So here he is with the musicians of his band, probably in the early 1890s. He leaves town, though. In the grand tradition of band leaders in the 1800s, he gets a better offer. Appleton puts too much money in front of him to say no, and so he moves away in 1894. And it's going to be a while after he leaves and takes most of the good musicians with him before we have another band like this in Wausau. It's going to be C.S. Cohn here is going to show up in a few years and eventually put together a group for the Spanish-American War in 1898. And from there, we're off. But yeah. Finally, we should talk about the Liederkranz, which doesn't go away, despite, here, let me quote Marchetti here real quick. To keep a German male choir in existence is a difficult undertaking. Good voices are rare, the songs are sung in the German language, and the field from which singers can be recruited is therefore limited. But there will be, for many years yet to come, splendid material for one choir. And the progress in education and the advancement of the fine arts, there is no fear of German song ever dying out in Wausau. And in some ways, he's right. In some ways, there's a bit of a challenge on the horizon. He's writing this in 1913, about a year before World War I kicks off and a few years before the United States gets pulled in. German song is not so popular during the World Wars as the United States is at war with Germany, but nevertheless, German choir continues. When Schubert leaves, they could have been like all of those other groups and have disbanded. But Gustav Müller steps in. I believe this is him in the front row with the thing. This is at their golden and jubilee, the 50th anniversary in 1934. By this point, he had actually given over the band to someone else. But he's able to keep the group together, and they continue to sing not even into the 30s, but into the 1940s. They disband formally in 1946. So one of the legacies, I guess, of Schubert continues. So an interesting guy. And I don't know, and part of me is kind of feels guilty for talking about someone you should know who was here for maybe a decade. But whether or not he is somebody whose legacy is concretely here, he is somebody who represents this period very well. This is a period of excitement in the late 1870s. Like, there's a population that's moving here. It's a very German, very excited. We got music, we got bands, music galore, as Marchetti writes about it. And there's a lot of stuff that's happening. But it also shows that, it's going to be a bit before the Wausau area community can support professional musicians. Cohn and his contemporary Barney Schultz and some of the other people in the 20th century. But yeah, so interesting guy, interesting story. Now you know Frank Schubert. Yeah, I'm going to take a quick look here and just see if there's any questions or comments. I am very acutely aware that my camera decided to do that lag thing again. I don't know if that is actually is still happening. on your end, but it is on mine. It's kind of annoying. That's all right. Just checking here. I will say, by the way, if you're interested in music, these guys, Schubert and company, while there isn't a direct correlation, we still have music played kind of in that tradition. We can kind of trace our roots back there. The Wausau Concert Band, by the way, starts our first concert of the season is this afternoon if you're watching it live on Thursday. But throughout the year, the summer here for the next few weeks, we're going to have regular concerts. I'll be playing saxophone in the group, so say hello if you see this and come out for that. But yeah, some live music. There's music. These concerts, this sort of concert band scene is maybe not something we see very often in the public, but there's a lot of communities: Mosinee, Merrill, Marshfield, Athens, Stevens Point, Wausau. If you're in the central Wisconsin area, or actually probably wherever you are, there probably is some music being played during the summer. Open, free concerts. So if you want to take advantage of that, yeah, some good music out there. Cool. Well, I don't see any questions, and I've probably gone on a little bit longer than I intended to, so I think maybe I'll wrap it up. Again, next week we are going to continue the story with something a little different, which is Vilas MacMuller. Another good, interesting story about a founding, maybe more recent story here, but yeah, it should be good. And yeah, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.